Hi everybody. This semester I'm going to try something a little bit new, so I'm going to try recording lectures for those of you who prefer to listen rather than read lecture notes. I will still put up the written lecture notes for you guys to read and have to refer back to, but I'm also going to try doing videotaped lectures. Last week I told you guys a couple things that I want you to be thinking about as you do the readings for the course. And those ideas will work for most of your courses in your college career. Sometimes we're reading for information rather than reading for entertainment, and those two things can be a little bit different. So the advice that I gave you was to try to answer some specific questions while you're reading. The first is, what's the main point that the author is trying to make in this article? That's the thesis statement. What is their thesis statement? That would be their primary claim. The second is, what evidence is the author using to convince me of the thesis that he, she, or they are asserting? So you're going to be looking at the different ways that they're trying to prove that thesis statement. And they can be doing that in various ways. They will provide either examples, they may provide other authors' information to try to prove that the point that they're making is a valid point. How does the author interpreting the evidence? How is the author interpreting the evidence that he, she, or they are using? So, are they interpreting that evidence in a way that makes sense? So, are they using an assertion from an author that really wasn't the point the author was trying to make? And does that make sense given what they're arguing about? Point number 4 is, how does this author's point add to my understanding of other readings on this subject? I will never give you just one reading on any topic. You'll have several readings on the topic. So one of the things that you want to do is look for, how does this reading fit in with these other readings? What additional information does it give you? And then finally, the last question is, how does this author's point fit into my own experience of this topic? And I ask you that question because I think it's really important. At this point in your life, most of you have a lot of expertise in your own culture. You know how to navigate it, or you're at least conscious of when you don't navigate social situations. And that's because you've been doing folklore all your lives. I often say the only thing that I'm doing is giving you an academic language to talk about things that you already know about and that you've already been doing. For example, how fast do you drive on the interstate? And do you call it the interstate, or do you call it an expressway, or do you call it a freeway? There are lots of different things it can be called. A parkway. How do you know how fast to drive on those things? Now there's a limit posted on all of them, right, for how fast you're supposed to drive. And around Kentucky, a lot of those are posted at 70 miles an hour, but not everyone drives 70 miles an hour, and most of us drive over 70 miles an hour. So how fast is too fast? How at what speed do you start looking like a jerk? Is it 10 miles over? Is it 20 miles over? Is it 15? There are formal rules for this, but there are also lots of informal ones that aren't posted somewhere. So just like there are rules for how you dress when you go to different occasions. And if you're not dressed appropriately, then we're often embarrassed when we get there and find out that we're overdressed or underdressed for someone. Or how you say hi to someone, whether you fist bump, whether you handshake, whether you wave, how close you stand to them. All of those things are social rules and bits of folklore that you've learned to navigate throughout your lives. So you guys are experts on navigating social situations, or at least knowing when you're not navigating them. So folklore tends to look at the study of traditional culture. Now, traditional culture is a little bit different from popular or pop culture, and it's different from formal or institutional or high culture. And when we look at traditional culture, one of the ways that it is different from pop culture or formal culture is how it is transmitted. Traditional culture is usually transmitted from one person to one person or to a small group, so maybe 4 or 5 people. Um, Pop culture is usually passed on from one to many people. So when we talk about popular culture, we're talking about things like movies or books or um, things that or BuzzFeed Unsolved, where you have one person that's passing that information on to many people. Those would be examples of popular culture. Now, those popular culture examples can bleed over into traditional culture. For example, fandoms. Um, if you have a group of people that get together to watch the Avengers movie and then they talk about which Avenger they think is the best and why they would want to be that Avenger, then we're talking about a fandom and we're talking about a group that has something in common. And so pop culture will bleed over into folk culture or traditional culture pretty easily. Formal or institutional culture is when we have few people passing it on to many people. And usually that's going to be information that you get from church or from the government or from a school. So you will have a few people who are considered experts in that field, who have studied it and have this knowledge that they are passing on to other people. And that's what we call traditional or high culture. So traditional or high culture may change, but it tends to do so really, really slowly. Pop culture changes really, really quickly. Traditional culture will change. It's not the same every time you see it or hear it or uh, tell the story. So, for example, a ghost story. If you tell a ghost story to one group of people, you might tell it in a certain way, and then if you're telling it to another person, you might tell it in a different way, and then that person may tell the story to another person, and they may tell it completely differently from the way that they heard it the first time. So traditional culture changes. It's not necessarily static. Um, so we differentiate between those three spheres of culture by looking at the pattern of transmission, who tells whom. We also look at how the artists or the performers are trained. If they're formally trained, like in a college or a school, that would tend to go with more formal or institutional culture. Whereas if they learned it from a friend or from an older family member or something like that, that would tend to point more toward traditional culture. What is the staging, framing, the setting of the performance? If you are going to an opera in an opera house and seeing that very formal event, that's going to be a whole lot different from vegging out on your bed with a bag of chips watching a video on YouTube. Okay. Um, we also look at how the art is meant to be put to use. If it's something that's meant to be used every day, we're typically going to be talking about traditional culture. If it's something that is more venerated and perhaps displayed in a museum somewhere, then you may be talking about high culture. It would be the difference between a quilt, which was made by a family member that you keep on your bed, versus Van Gogh. All right. Um, we also look at who owns it. If it's copyrighted, we're typically going to be talking about either popular culture or um, high culture, because those things are owned by someone. In the case of formal or institutional culture, those things may have passed into the public domain. But if it's copyrighted, if it's owned by someone, then it's typically going to be either popular culture or perhaps formal culture. We also look at how much money is involved in the performance, and how is it talked about in schools. So if it is in a school setting, if it's treated as something that is taught and held up as an example, for example, literature. And I say that probably because I'm an old literature teacher. But when we talk about literature, it's something that we talk about and analyze in a very specific way, whereas we mostly don't analyze traditional culture, stories told in traditional culture in the same ways. So those are the ways that we can differentiate between something being popular culture and something being traditional culture. Although, as I said, the two things bleed over really, really easily. So I also want to talk about the ideas of things that stay static and the things that change. When we talk about traditional culture or traditions of folklore, there are aspects of it that stay the same, and those things stay the same so that people can recognize that tradition. Then there are things about that tradition that change, and they may change for many reasons. It may become inconvenient to do something a certain way. It may become unsafe to do something a certain way. And so we may change those traditions in order to keep practicing them. Now, we call that in folklore the principles of dynamism and conservatism. All right? Dynamism and conservatism. Dynamism meaning dynamic, things that change, and conservatism meaning things that stay the same. All right. All traditions have both. All right. We may have folks that feel a certain way about traditions changing, and we might describe those folks as being conservative, but that is not what we're talking about here. All right. Dynamism and conservatism, the way that traditions either change or they stay the same. And traditions do both. My favorite example is the Christmas tree. Once upon a time, Christmas trees were live trees. And they were decorated with real candles and usually fruits and berries and things that people had around their house. Obviously, you may be able to see the dangers of this particular practice by using real lit candles on a tree that possibly is dry and your house could burn down, right? So the Christmas tree tradition has changed. Um, Now we use electric lights and we may use a fake tree. This was a point of negotiation in my marriage. My partner was very much a live tree. We must have a live tree for Christmas. While I was in the fake tree department because I don't like to clean up needles and I don't like to have to water the tree, and I feel bad about cutting down a tree just to use it for a few weeks. So that was a bone of contention in our home. But the tree may be fake, the tree may be real. You probably use store-bought decorations rather than making your own. There have been lots of changes in the practice of the tradition of having a Christmas tree. But you will still have something triangular that resembles a tree and is decorated in some way to make the tree special, not an everyday tree. So, for example, if you go on Pinterest or you go on Etsy, you're going to find folks that have cut blocks of wood into a triangular shape and stuck a star on the top of them, and we recognize that as a Christmas tree. It's not even a tree. We used to go to an event when we lived in Maryland. We lived near Baltimore, and so in Baltimore there was a block on 34th Street, and all of the row homes would decorate their houses for Christmas, and they called it the Miracle on 34th Street. So we would go down there, and there was a man there, and he had a Christmas tree in his front yard, and it was made entirely out of hubcaps. He was very into recycling, so he went and got all these hubcaps, and he built a huge Christmas tree out of hubcaps. When you looked at it, you recognized, because it was triangular and because it was obviously an out of the ordinary type of thing, you recognize that as the hubcap Christmas tree. And you can go onto Google and you can Google hubcap Christmas tree Baltimore, and you will get to see pictures of the hubcap Christmas tree. But that was all part of that Christmas tradition. So when you read the reading this week, there's going to be a lot of information, and that information is going to be really important. I also don't know how practical it's going to be for you to absorb all of that information at once. So if you don't completely get it with the reading this week, things will become more clear as we take the theoretical parts and put them with concrete examples. Okay. For now, there are some basic things I want you to keep in mind. Number one, in the world of academic folklore, anything can be a text. I know we're used to talking about texts that we get on our phone, or we're used to talking about texts as in an article or a book that we have to read for a class. But when we're talking about folklore, a text is anything that communicates something to someone. The text is just the thing that's being studied for the way that it communicates. So a text could be a text could be an article, but a text can also be a photograph or a quilt or a dance or a way that you shake hands. All of those things can be texts. So in folklore, the definition of text is really, really wide. And you guys need to know that because it's different from what you usually experience. I also want you guys to know that normally when people talk about folklore, they're talking about something that's fake or not true or something that's not believable. For example, I went with my husband on a trip and we visited my brother-in-law, and they mentioned that a house that they lived in as a child, they both thought it was haunted. And I said, oh, what a nice piece of folklore, or something like that. And he said, oh, this isn't folklore. This is true, right? So when we talk about folklore, we're talking about anything. We're talking about things that traditional cultures do, right? We're not talking about things that are untrue or fake or old wives' tales. But old wives' tales are pieces of folklore, but they're certainly not all that folklore is. I also want to make it clear from the get-go that while traditions can be passed from older to younger people, and a lot of times that's how people think about folklore, it's traditions that you get from older folks. For example, a grandparent or a parent. We think about traditions in that way. While traditions can be passed from older people to younger people, they can also be passed between people of the same age, right? We call that horizontal transmission. When you learn a tradition from your peers, versus vertical transmission, where you learn something from someone who's older than you. So you may learn how to do stunts on a bicycle from your peers, or do stunts on a skateboard from your peers, or you may learn dances from your peers, or sayings from your peers. So I want to be really clear about the fact that traditions don't just come from older folks to younger folks. They also are transmitted across groups of the same age. So another point, and I think it's point number 4, folklore looks at how groups communicate with each other. So groups can be as small as 2 people. We call that a dyad. Or it can be a whole country full of people. All that is required is that the people have something in common, all right? And we are all part of different intersecting groups or subcultures. And for any of those groups, there are certain customs that the group keeps that identifies someone as a member of that group. Usually those kinds of customs are used to differentiate who is and who isn't part of the group. You know, all the ways that you tell if you're a cool kid or not, right? Those are kind of the ways that we differentiate who is part of a group versus who's not. That may be certain types of slang that we use. It may be certain expressions that we use. It may be certain clothes that we wear. It may be certain holidays that we celebrate. But generally, you will have something that differentiates the inside group from the outside group. All right. Now, the caveat to this is rule number one, and we always have to remember rule number one of folklore when we're talking about groups of people. All right. Rule number one is that no group or culture is completely homogenous. And that means that within any large group of people, there will be people who practice some of the traditions and customs of the group in a different way. They may have a different motivation, or they may not practice some of the customs at all, right? You may live in a household that was raised nominally Christian, and you may not put up a Christmas tree at all. Or you may use a fake tree versus a live tree, or you may not put out a nativity scene with the little baby Jesus. So there are different ways that folks within a culture or a group practice the traditions. It's not homogenous. It's not everybody doing it in the group. I also want to remind you guys that folklore is divided into three broad and often overlapping categories. The first category is oral or narrative folklore. And when we talk about oral or narrative folklore, we're talking about things that people say or write. So this could be a joke, this could be a story, this could be a saying. Those kinds of items would be oral or narrative folklore. There's also customary or performance. This is the kind of folklore that people do. So it might be a special way of shaking hands, or it might be a dance, or it might be a way of cooking food, or a way of practicing a ritual. That would be customary or performance. We also have material culture. Material culture is the things that people make or use. So that might be a quilt, that might be a cake. That might be a picture that you draw as you tell a joke. It's a thing, all right? And that's what we call material culture. Now, McNeil, in our reading this week, adds one more category to that, and she adds the category of belief. She says that things we believe are their own separate category of folklore, but all of these things have a lot of overlap within one text. For example, you might believe in ghosts, which would be belief, right? So you might tell a story about a ghost that you heard of, which would be oral or narrative folklore. And then you might go to the place where the ghost is said to appear, and you might follow a ritual that's supposed to summon the ghost, which would be customary or performance. You might use a Ouija board, or you might use runes, or you might draw something that's supposed to communicate with the ghost, or you might leave an offering for the spirit. And those items would be material culture. So within that one example, we have all of the different aspects or the different categories of folklore. Now, I know that's a lot of information. I was really going to try to do this in 20 minutes, but I don't think that's going to be realistic. I do want to talk a little bit about belief, because belief is something that we're going to talk a lot about in this class. It's kind of the whole basis for supernatural folklore. Belief is never a yes or no, on or off switch. Belief is a performance. It's connected to our doubts. It's connected to our faith, our values, and how we want the world to be, how we want to see the world. Belief in the supernatural isn't just primitive people trying to understand science that's beyond them, which was an idea that was perpetuated early in the field. When we talk about James Frazer and the Golden Bough and sympathetic magic, this idea that primitive people believed in supernatural things because they could not understand science. That's not actually the case. All cultures, even rational ones, have beliefs. Science doesn't eradicate or explain away supernatural belief. People find a way for those beliefs to coexist in their practices. So while there is an importance in truth and what we call ontological validity or objective fact, we have to understand that belief isn't questioning the same things necessarily. Barbara Walker says in her reading, how groups regard the supernatural contributes to the thought and behavior, and by attending those patterns, we gain a fuller understanding of what is meaningful. So even if we're looking at a conspiracy theory that has been proven absolutely false, there's still something to be learned about the group that perpetuates that theory from looking at the theory itself. So in this class, we aren't proving or disproving that ghosts exist. And sometimes I have students that come in that really, really want that, but that's not necessarily what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about these ideas as part of lived experience, and what they tell us about worldviews or identity or value systems in a culture or a group. I want to introduce you today to Bascom's Four Functions of Folklore. Now, we're going to talk much more about William Bascom's Four Functions of Folklore next week. But I do want to at least introduce you to the idea of functionalism. Functionalism is the idea that pieces of folklore do something for the culture that shares them. All right. And so William Bascom, back in 1956, wrote this really good article that looks at how pieces of folklore function within the culture that shares them. All right. And he says that folklore functions in one of four ways. There are a lot of F's in that sentence. First of all, folklore can function as an escape from the repressions of a society. Now, we may see this in tall tales. We may see this in jokes. We see this in revenge tales, which are pretty popular on the internet, where somebody wronged somebody. Stories about Karen getting her comeuppance. All right. Those are stories that function as an escape from the repressions in society, because people don't always get what they deserve, even when they're a Karen. So when we read these stories about someone getting what they deserve for being a jerk, that's kind of an escape from the repressions of our society. We often can't take those matters into our own hands. So reading about someone who transgresses that and gets revenge on someone else, those are an escape from the repressions in our society. The second way that folklore can function is to validate and justify institutions and rituals. So those may be explanatory tales, fables, myths, legends. These are things that warn about the consequences when cultural norms aren't followed, right? One of my favorite examples of this is near-death experience stories. So oftentimes in popular culture, when people talk about near-death experiences, they talk about seeing a white light and people going toward the white light or not going toward the white light, right? And it's comforting and it's heavenly or ethereal, and usually when we hear those stories, it's good things. Now, you can look and you can find people who have near-death experiences where they go the other direction. All right. And in those experiences, they see fire and demons and hell and all of these things, right? And so those kinds of stories are pieces of folklore that drive home the point to us that we need to be good. Because if we're good, then at the end of our lives, we're going to get the white light and the comforting feeling and St. Peter at the pearly gate inviting us in. And if we're not good, then we're going to end up burning forever in hell with demons poking us with pitchforks, right? So those pieces are validating and justifying institutions and rituals, all right? Another function of folklore is educational, because it reinforces the morals and values of a culture. So, for example, fairy tales are an example of this. Contemporary legends are an example of this. There are rituals that are an example of this. I don't know how many of you have ever gotten the email about do not get out of your car at Walmart and get that $100 bill out from under your windshield wiper because there are human traffickers that are just waiting to grab you when you jump out of your car. Those kinds of contemporary legends reinforce morals and values, right? The value is safety, right? Excuse me. Women in particular need to be hyper aware when they are out in public so that they don't get snatched by human traffickers. And those types of stories are just reinforcing that value or those morals. The fourth way that folklore functions is to exert social control or social pressure on a community to conform. And oftentimes this is because groups want to be cohesive. They want to stick together so that they continue to exist. And so there will be social control or social pressure to kind of keep that community to conform. So, for example, this might be rumors. You might hear a rumor about a certain ethnic group that has moved into your community eating pets. And we actually, there's an article that we look at in my food waste class that talks about that, right? That a group of people moved into this town and then rumors started that those people were eating longtime residents' pets, right? The goal of that type of folklore is to keep this community together and to exclude these folks from that community. All right. So we look at, when we're talking about functionalism, we're talking about what pieces of folklore do for the culture that shares them. So that is going to reveal attitudes and values that are important to the culture. Many times they would not state that out loud themselves. Just like I said about the story about not getting out of your car at Walmart to get the $100 bill off the windshield, right? Those types of stories are usually sent to keep women safe. That's usually directly stated in the email or the text message or the Facebook post or however it came to you, okay? It's to keep women safe, right? And safety is a value, and people want to be safe. But these types of messages also reinforce that it's women's responsibility to keep themselves safe, and not necessarily that it's men's responsibility not to attack women. All right. And so there are different ways that those messages are focused that makes it clear who is supposed to do what in what society. All right, so I have talked for 32 minutes. I feel like that is plenty long enough for a lecture. Please remember that you have discussion board posts this week. There will be 3 different questions. You will post your initial response to one question, and then you will need to go in before Friday, and you will need to comment on someone else's posts. You do not have to do that on the same question that you responded to yourself. You can go into the other questions, and in fact, I would encourage you to go into the other questions and look at what other people are posting and perhaps respond to those. So if you have questions, please email me. If you have an emergency, please text me. Otherwise, I hope this is a great second week of classes, and I will talk to you more soon. Good night.